The world from my office on the 48th floor of the Salesforce Tower is a silent, glittering abstraction. San Francisco spreads out below me, a map of someone else's life, all muted traffic and remote, unknowable ambition. I've always preferred this view. Distance makes things clean. From up here, you can't see the grit or the desperation. You only see the pattern, the flow of capital, the elegant, brutal dance of acquisition and failure. My job is to decide which parts of the pattern live and which parts die. Most days, I feel nothing about it at all, Doc. This morning was a Tuesday. I had just concluded a conference call where I'd methodically vivisected a floundering biotech firm, exposing its bloated management structure and flawed clinical trial data. I'd offered them a payout at 30 cents on the dollar. An insult, a mercy killing. They would take it. They always did. I was sipping my second espresso of the day, feeling that familiar, sterile satisfaction of a clean kill, when my analyst, a perpetually nervous young man named David, entered my glass-walled office. Double quotes, Ms. Marshall, he said, placing a thin blue folder on my desk as if it were a bomb. The prospectus on that distressed timber portfolio just came in. It's small fry, probably not worth your time, but you asked to see everything from the Pacific Northwest. Leave it, I said, not looking up from my screen. My gaze was fixed on a real-time stock ticker, a river of green and red that was far more interesting than some bankrupt lumber operation. He scurried out. For an hour, the blue folder sat on the edge of my desk, an island of insignificance in my world of high-stakes transactions. I was about to sweep it into the recycling bin when the cover slid open slightly. A single name, printed in stark black letters at the top of the executive summary, caught my eye. Redemption Peak, Oregon. The espresso cup in my hand stopped halfway to my lips. A name from a past I had surgically removed from my life. A ghost. Rattling a chain I thought I had long since buried. My heart gave a single, hard, unwelcome thud against my ribs. My composure, the cool, unbreachable wall I had spent 15 years building, wavered for a fraction of a second. I quickly masked it, my face settling back into its practiced neutral state, but the damage was done. The ghost was in the room, pulled the folder towards me. My hands, which could sign off on $100 million deal without a tremor, felt unsteady. I opened it. The document wasn't a story of a town. It was an autopsy report written in the cold language of finance. Population decline, minus 42% over 10 years. Median household income, 55% below state average. Primary employer, Redemption Peak Timber Mill, ceased operations 18 months prior. For every sterile data point, a vivid, unwanted memory bloomed in my mind. Portfolio assets include Redemption Peak Timber Mill, liquidation value, $1.2 million, 1,200 acres of surrounding timberland, fire damaged, and 28 commercial properties on Main Street, 87% vacancy rate, Main Street. I remembered Mrs. Gable's bakery on the corner, the smell of fresh bread that used to fill the morning air. I remembered the single-screen movie theater where I'd had my first kiss. I remembered the hardware store owned by my best friend's father. All of them now just numbers in a column, their value assessed in cents on the dollar. Key liabilities include outstanding municipal bonds, unpaid property taxes, and significant environmental cleanup costs associated with the mill. It was a complete systemic failure, a town circling the drain, a place that was, for all intents and purposes, already dead. And as I read, the professional, detached analysis of the venture capitalist began to merge with the raw, unhealed wound of the girl who had escaped. This wasn't just a failed town. This was their failed town. The town that had called me a traitor. The polished chrome and glass of my office seemed to dissolve. The air, growing thick and heavy, smelling of pine dust and the damp heat of too many bodies packed into a small space. I am 18 again. I am standing on the stage of the high school gymnasium. It's not graduation. It's a town meeting, and the mood is not celebratory. It's terrified. The mill has just announced the first round of major layoffs, and the shockwave is tearing through every family, every home. The air is thick with the scent of fear. My guidance counselor has insisted I make an announcement. I have just been awarded the Stansfield Scholarship, a full ride to Stanford University. It's supposed to be a piece of good news in a sea of bad, a symbol of hope. I clear my throat, my voice trembling as I speak into the microphone. I just wanted to thank the scholarship committee, I stammer. I'm so grateful for the opportunity. I promise I'll work hard and make Redemption Peak proud. The applause is sparse, uncertain. They don't see a local girl making good. They see a lifeboat, and I'm the only one with a ticket. Then a figure rises from the bleachers. Caleb Thorne. Of course, it's Caleb, high school quarterback, town golden boy. His future as certain as the sunrise management track at the mill, just like his father. He walks to the microphone set up on the floor, his expression a mask of righteous disappointment. Make Redemption Peak proud, he says into the mic, his voice booming through the gym, dripping with theatrical sorrow. How are you going to do that, Jenna? From a fancy classroom in California, a murmur ripples through the crowd. My dad got his layoff notice today, Caleb continues, his voice cracking with emotion. So did half the people in this room. We are in the fight of our lives here. We need every single person to stay and fight with us, to work, to organize, to keep this town from dying. He turns and looks directly at me, his eyes cold. But you're not staying, are you? You're taking the first lifeboat off a sinking ship and calling it success. He turns back to the crowd. She's not one of us anymore. She's abandoning us when we need her most. She's a traitor. The word hangs in the hot, stagnant air. It's a spark on dry timber. The crowd, terrified and looking for someone to blame, seizes it. The murmurs turn to angry shouts. I see the faces of my friends' parents, people who had known me since I was a child, their expressions now twisted into masks of resentment and betrayal. I stand there, alone on the stage, the heat of their collective hatred of physical force. They weren't just letting me go, they were exiling me. I blinked, and the gymnasium dissolved back into the silent, air-conditioned chill of my office. The memory was as sharp and painful as it had been 15 years ago. I had made them proud, all right. I had become one of the most successful venture capitalists on the West Coast. And they had died. Their town, their pride, their way of life, all of it was now nothing more than a portfolio of distressed assets in a cheap blue folder. I looked at the numbers again. The liquidation value, the vacancy rates, the debt. A cold, predatory smile touched my lips. Any other investor would see a lost cause, a financial black hole, a place to be stripped for parts and left to rot. But I saw something else. I saw Anne. Opportunity. The perfect revenge wasn't leaving them to die. That was too easy. The perfect revenge was to become the one thing they now needed more than anything else in the world. A savior who owned them. A savior who would never let them forget who held the power. The traitor, returning to rule over the ruins. My hand reached for the intercom button, my movements now sharp and decisive. The hesitation was gone. The ghost of the past was no longer something to be feared. It was a tool to be used. Claire, I said, my voice as calm and clear as glass. Double quotes, yes, Miss Marshall. Clear my schedule for the rest of the week. Book me the first flight to Portland tomorrow morning. And have a long-range SUV waiting for me at the airport. I'm going to Oregon to conduct a site visit for a potential acquisition. There, was a pause, of course. May I ask the name of the acquisition target? I looked down at the blue folder at the name of the town that had cast me out. Redemption Peak, I said, my voice like ice. The whole thing. The drive from Portland to Redemption Peak is a journey backward in time. For the first hour, the highway is a familiar river of clean, efficient asphalt, flanked by the manicured suburbs and outlet malls that are the universal language of American prosperity. But then you turn off onto Route 26, heading east into the mountains, and the language begins to change. The landscape sheds its polish. The trees towering Douglas firs and ancient cedars close in, their shadows draping the road in a permanent twilight. The cell service, my tether to the world of stock quotes and board meetings, flickered, then died completely. I was alone with the humming engine of the rented Lincoln Navigator and the ghosts I was driving to meet. With every mile, the carefully constructed persona of Jenna Marshall, venture capitalist, began to feel like an ill-fitting suit. The San Francisco armor, so effective in a boardroom, felt thin and useless out here. The air itself, thick with the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and rain, was a memory. It was the smell of my childhood, a smell I hadn't realized I had so successfully forgotten. The first sign you're approaching Redemption Peak is the clear-cutting. Vast, ugly scars on the mountainsides, where the timber companies had taken everything and left behind nothing but stumps and mud. It was an old wound, now covered with the thin fuzz of secondary growth, like a poorly healed scar. Then came the town sign, or what was left of it. Welcome to Redemption Peak, a town built on timber and pride. The sign was peeling, the proud green letters flaking away to reveal rotting wood underneath. Someone had spray painted a crude question mark after the word pride. I slowed the big SUV to a crawl as I entered the town proper. It was a graveyard, a ghost town where the ghosts were still walking around, waiting for their own burials. The silence was the first thing that hit me. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of my Sunday mornings back in Cybelam. It was a dead, hollow silence. The sound of industry was gone. The rumble of logging trucks, the 5 p.m. mill whistle that had been. The town's heartbeat, the chatter of shoppers on Main Street, all erased. All that was left was the wind whistling through the empty window frames of boarded-up shops. I drove down Main Street, my knuckles white on the leather-wrapped steering wheel. Each dead storefront was a punch to the gut. Gable's Bakery, where the scent of cinnamon rolls used to perfume the entire block, was now just a plywood-covered facade. A faded, ghostly outline of the word bakery still visible on the brick above. Miller's Hardware, where my best friend's dad had patiently taught me the difference between a Phillips and a flathead screwdriver. The Bijou Theater, its marquee proclaiming closed until further notice in sun-bleached plastic letters. The notice had probably been there for 5 years. I parked the SUV in front of the town hall, a squat, tired-looking brick building that seemed to be the only place with its lights still on. I didn't go in, not yet. I needed to walk. I needed to feel the full weight of the decay. I walked past the high school. The football field where Caleb Thorne and his team had been gods was a field of weeds. The bleachers were splintered and gray. I could almost hear the echoes of the marching band, the roar of the crowd on a crisp Friday night. Now, there was only the mournful creak of a rusted swing set on the elementary school playground next door. This was the town that had called me a traitor. I had expected to feel a sense of vindication, a smug satisfaction in their failure. See? I wanted to whisper to the ghosts. I was right to leave. I escaped, but I didn't feel smug. I felt a profound, aching sadness that caught me completely off guard. It was the grief of looking at a beloved childhood photograph that has been burned around the edges. I hated this place for what it had done to me, but I also hated what had been done to it. The two feelings churned inside me, a confusing, bitter cocktail. My walk ended at the town's only remaining diner, the Timberline, its neon sign flickering erratically. I needed coffee. I pushed open the door, a small bell announcing my arrival. With a cheerful, inappropriate jingle, the handful of patrons at the counter, old men in flannel shirts and weathered baseball caps, all turned to look at me. Their conversations died. In a town this small, a stranger in an expensive coat was an event. The woman behind the counter, a tired-looking woman my age, with lines of worry etched around her eyes, squinted at me. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Jenna?" she said, her voice a mix of shock and suspicion. "Jenna Marshall?" It was Sarah Gable. Her mother had owned the bakery. We had been in the same chemistry class. "Hello, Sarah," I said, my voice cool and even. "My God," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "We all heard you were some kind of big shot down in California. Never thought we'd see you back here." Her tone wasn't friendly. It was the cautious greeting one gives to a predator that has wandered back into its old territory. "Just in town on business," I said, sliding onto a cracked vinyl stool. At the counter. "Coffee, please, black." As she poured, one of the old men spoke, his voice raspy. "Your dad would be rolling in his grave if he saw the state of the mill." "My dad is buried in the church cemetery on the hill," I replied without looking at him. "I doubt he's concerned." "With the mill?" The silence that followed was thick and hostile. They weren't my people anymore. I was an alien, an invader. I drank my coffee quickly, paid with a $50 bill, and told Sarah to keep the change, an act of casual big city wealth that I knew would only deepen their resentment. I walked out without another word. It was time. I crossed the street to the town hall. The meeting room smelled of stale coffee, old wood, and desperation. The 5 members of the town council sat at a long, scratched oak table. They were all faces from my past. Mr. Miller from the hardware store, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Mrs. Davison, the former high school librarian, looking a decade older than she was. And at the head of the table, Caleb Thorne. The years had not been kind to the golden boy. His confident, athletic swagger was gone, replaced by the weary slump of a man carrying an impossible weight. His face was leaner, harder, and there were faint traces of gray in his short-cropped hair. But when his eyes met mine, I saw the old fire, the same pride, the same deep, abiding resentment. He didn't offer to shake my hand. "Jenna," he said, his voice a flat, formal welcome. "Thank you for coming. We appreciate you taking the time to consider an investment in your hometown. Your hometown." The words were a deliberate jab. For the next hour, I listened. They made their pitch. It was earnest, desperate, and heartbreakingly amateur. Caleb, using a wobbly projector and handwritten charts, walked me through their proposal for a public-private partnership. They wanted me to invest capital to retrofit the mill for specialty lumber, to provide low-interest loans to help businesses reopen on Main Street. They were asking for a lifeline. They were asking for a partner. I listened to the entire presentation. Without saying a word, my face a neutral, unreadable mask. I asked no questions, I offered no encouragement. My silence seemed to suck the hope out of the room. When Caleb finally finished, his voice hoarse, he looked at me, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. For the first time in his life, Caleb Thorne needed something from me. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, painful moment. I looked at each of them, at the faces of the people who had stood by and watched as their golden boy branded. Me a traitor, I gathered my things, placing my pen neatly beside my notepad. I stood up. "Thank you for the presentation," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet, dusty room. It was very thorough. A flicker of hope ignited in Caleb's eyes. "Unfortunately," I continued, my voice as cold and clean as the glass, On my San Francisco office, your proposal is fundamentally flawed. Your financial projections are speculative, and the risk is untenable. I looked directly at Caleb, the man who had been my chief accuser. The answer is no. Your proposal is denied. The silence in the wake of my dismissal was a physical thing. It was heavier than the dusty air, thicker than the years of failure that stained the wood-paneled walls of the town hall. The 5 members of the town council stared at me, their faces a collage of disbelief, shock, unwounded pride. I had flown all this way, sat through their desperate, hopeful presentation, and swatted it away like a fly. Caleb was the first to break. The mask of the calm professional council president cracked, and the face of the proud, cornered man I remembered from the high school gymnasium flared into view. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the worn linoleum floor. No, he repeated, his voice dangerously quiet at first, then rising with incredulity. You fly up here from your glass tower in San Francisco, you let us lave it. Soul of this town bare for you, and your answer is just no. He took a step towards my end of the table. So that's it then? You just came here to laugh? To see for yourself how badly the traitors you left behind have failed? Was this just a sightseeing trip for you, Jenna? His voice was raw, filled with the bitterness of a man who had been forced to beg and been denied. The other council members shifted uncomfortably, but they didn't stop him. He was voicing the ugly, fearful thought in all their hearts. I didn't flinch. I let his anger wash over me, absorbing it without reaction. I met his furious gaze with a look of utter, unnerving calm. I let the silence stretch after his outburst, allowing his accusations to hang in the air and then wither. I didn't say, I wasn't interested in an investment, Caleb. I said finally, my voice cutting cleanly through the tense atmosphere. I said your proposal is denied. I paused, letting the implication land. A flicker of confusion, quickly followed by a desperate, unwanted sliver of hope, appeared on their faces. Your plan is a request for a lifeline? I continued, my tone shifting from dismissive to that of a lecturer addressing a room of slow students. You want a partner to give you a cash infusion so you can keep doing the same things that led this town to bankruptcy? You want me to patch the holes in a sinking ship? I am not in the business of patching holes. I am in the business of buying ships, stripping them down to their core components, and rebuilding them to be faster and more profitable than they ever were before. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. This was no longer their meeting. It was mine. Your proposal is denied. But I have a counteroffer, a path forward. It is not, however, a partnership. And it is not a negotiation. I saw Caleb's jaw tighten. He hated this. He hated me. But he sat back down. He knew, as they all did, that they had no choice but to listen. Here are the terms, I began, my voice crisp and devoid of emotion. I ticked each point off with a clinical precision that I knew would be more terrifying than any emotional outburst. First, the financial component. My firm, Marshall Capital, will not be a partner. We will be the sole proprietor. We will purchase the Redemption Peak Timber Mill, the 1,200 acres of surrounding timberland, and the deeds to all 28 of your vacant commercial properties on Main Street. We will purchase them for the exact assessed liquidation value. Listed in the prospectus, a one-time cash payment of $4.7 million. This payment will be made directly to the town's accounts. It will be enough to settle your municipal bonds and pay off your outstanding debts to the state. It will wipe your slate clean. The town, as a government entity, will be solvent. A murmur went through the room. This was more than they had hoped for, a clean slate. No debt. Mr. Miller, the former hardware store owner, looked almost tearful. With relief, I let them enjoy the feeling for a moment before dropping the other shoe. Second, The operational component, I said, my gaze sweeping across their faces. Upon acquisition, a new economic development board will be formed to oversee all investment, hiring, and strategic planning for the revitalization of this town. I will be the chairperson of that board. My firm will hold a 51% controlling stake, giving me the deciding vote on all matters. The town council will be granted one seat on this board as a non-voting advisory position. Your role will be to provide local insight, not to approve or veto my decisions. All economic power, from setting wages at the mill to choosing which businesses are invited to lease the new storefronts, will rest solely with me. The flicker of hope in the room died instantly, replaced by a cold dread. I had offered them solvency at the cost of their sovereignty. Mrs. Davison, the librarian, paled. She understood immediately. I wasn't just buying their assets. I was buying their autonomy. You want to run the town? She whispered, horrified. I want to run the business of the town, I corrected her. You and the council can continue to manage the schools, the fire department, and the local dog park. But the economy, the engine of this place, will belong to me, because I am the one providing the fuel. I didn't give them time to debate. I moved to my next point, my eyes locking directly onto Caleb. Third, the management component. My voice was silk, but the words were steel. The new Redemption Timber Company will require a chief operating officer, a coup, someone to be my man on the ground, to oversee the day-to-day work of rebuilding the mill and revitalizing Main Street, someone who knows the people, who understands the work, and who commands the respect of the logging crews. I let a small, cruel smile touch my lips. That person will be you, Caleb. He stared at me, his face a blank mask of shock. He thought he had misheard me. You will be the highest paid employee in this town, I continued, twisting the knife. You will have a generous salary and benefits, but make no mistake, you will be an employee. You will report to me. You will execute my vision. You will take my directives, and you will be responsible for implementing them. Every success this town has will be under my leadership and through your labor. You will spend every day for the foreseeable future rebuilding the town you love, and you will do it on my terms, with my money. You will be the face of my authority. The room was utterly silent. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of my demand hung in the air. I had offered him a golden cage. I was making my greatest enemy the instrument of my will, forcing him into a position where his love for his town would require his complete and total submission to me. Before anyone could recover, I delivered the final casual blow, and fourth, a minor branding detail. As a symbol of this new era, the town square, currently named Pioneer Square, will be renamed. My marketing team will provide a list of approved names at a later date. I stood up, gathering my things. My presentation was over. I looked at the 5 stunned faces, at the maelstrom of emotions warring in Caleb's eyes, the pride, the hate, the crushing weight of responsibility. This is not an opening bid, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. This is the deal. All of it or none of it. You have 24 hours to convene an emergency council session and hold a vote. My offer expires tomorrow at noon. There will be no extensions and no negotiations. I walked to the door of the stuffy, wood-paneled room. I paused with my hand on the knob and looked back at them. Choose wisely, I said. It's the last significant choice you'll get to make for a very long time. And I walked out, leaving them alone in the ruins of their pride to debate the price of their salvation. The Redemption Peak High School gymnasium hadn't changed in 15 years. It still smelled of stale sweat, floor varnish, and the faint, lingering despair of teenage awkwardness. The same faded blue and gold banners proclaiming, "Go Timberwolves." hung limply from the rafters. The memories in this room were sharp and unwelcome. This was the exact spot where I had been branded, the stage where my life had been irrevocably cleaved in two. Tonight, I was returning not as the accused, but as the executioner. I arrived exactly on time. The gym was already packed, every inch of the worn wooden bleachers filled with the grim, anxious faces of my former hometown. They were all there, the loggers with their powerful, calloused hands now lying uselessly in their laps. The shop owners whose life's work was now a boarded-up memory. The young families who had stayed, clinging to a hope that had long since withered. Their collective gaze fell upon me as I entered, a wave of hostile energy that rippled through the room. I was the outsider, the ghost at the feast. The traitor. I ignored the whispers and the hard stares. Caleb and the other council members were seated at a long table on the stage where I had once stood. They had saved a seat for me there, a symbolic gesture of partnership. I ignored it. Instead, I took a single empty chair in the front row of the audience, directly facing the stage. I crossed my legs, placed my hands on my lap, and waited. The message was clear. I was not one of them. I was here to observe a decision, not to participate in a debate. Caleb stood and walked to the podium at the center of the stage. He looked exhausted, the harsh gymnasium lights carving deep shadows under his eyes. He gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles white. The golden boy was gone, replaced by a man about to perform his own vivisection for the good of the town. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice hoarse, amplified by the crackling, ancient PA system. "We all know why we're here. We are at a crossroads. For 2 years, this council has done everything we can to stop the bleeding. We've petitioned the state, we've applied for federal grants, we've tried to court new businesses, and we have failed. The admission hung in the air, a raw, painful truth that everyone knew but had never heard spoken so plainly by their leader. Town is bankrupt," he continued, his voice gaining a desperate strength. "The mill is silent, Main Street is empty. Our children are leaving because there is nothing for them here. The redemption peak we knew is gone. The alternative, if we do nothing, is that this town ceases to exist. It becomes a ghost town, a name on an old map." He paused, letting the weight of that reality settle over the crowd. "But last night," he said, "we received an offer, a proposal, not a partnership, a complete acquisition and revitalization plan from Marshall Capital." He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Every eye in the room darted to me. I remained perfectly still, my expression a neutral mask. "The offer is this," Caleb said, his voice flat as if reading an obituary. "Marshall Capital will purchase the mill, the timberlands, and the vacant properties, clearing all the town's debt. They will invest tens of millions of dollars to modernize the mill, creating hundreds of jobs. They will revitalize Main Street. They will, effectively, save this town from extinction." A murmur of cautious, desperate hope spread through the bleachers. Jobs, money, a future. "But it comes at a price," Caleb said, his voice dropping. "The deal is unconditional. Marshall Capital will have complete operational control over the town's economy. A new board chaired by them will make all decisions. The town council, we would serve only in an advisory capacity." The hopeful murmur died instantly, replaced by an angry, rumbling growl. "She wants to own us," a man yelled from the back. It was Mr. Miller, the former hardware store owner. "She wants to be queen." "What kind of a deal is that, Caleb?" another voice shouted. "We trade our pride for a paycheck from her," the room erupted. Accusations and angry shouts flew through the air, all directed at the stage, all directed at Caleb for even considering such a thing. They were terrified of dying, but they were furious at the terms of survival. I watched, silent, As Caleb weathered the storm, his face a grim mask, he held up his hands, pleading for quiet. "Listen to me," he yelled into the microphone. "Listen. What pride are you talking about? The pride of watching your neighbors use food stamps? The pride of boarding up your family business? The pride of telling your kids there's no future for them here?" His words, raw and painful, silenced the crowd again. "I know what this is," he said, his voice now trembling with a barely suppressed emotion. "This isn't about the deal. This is about who the deal is with. It's about Jenna Marshall." He looked at me then, a long, hard look across the short distance that felt like a mile. "I know what you're all thinking, because I've thought it myself." She left. She got out while the rest of us stayed to fight a losing battle. It's not fair that she comes back now, successful, powerful, and holds our lives in her hands. He was walking a tightrope, acknowledging their resentment while simultaneously trying to steer them away from it. But someone in the crowd wasn't going to let him off that easily. A man stood up in the middle of the bleachers. It was Tom, one of Caleb's old football buddies. "It's not just that she left, Caleb," he shouted, his voice echoing in the tents. "Silence. It's what you said. I was here. We were all here. You're the one who stood on this very stage and called her a traitor. You told us she was abandoning us. And now you're asking us to sell our town to her? What changed, Caleb? What's the price of your pride?" The accusation was a stiletto, sharp and perfectly aimed. The entire gymnasium went dead silent. Every single person was staring at Caleb, waiting. This was his moment of reckoning. His past words, his proud, righteous anger, had come back to claim their due. He closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, the fight was gone. All that was left was a deep, profound weariness. He looked out at the faces of the people who had followed him, trusted him, and he finally told them the hardest truth of all. "I was wrong," he said, the words quiet but clear over the PA system. "That day, I was an 8-year-old kid who thought pride was a currency. I thought grit and loyalty could fix a global timber market collapse. I thought that shaming one of our own for taking a chance at a better life was a sign of strength." He took a shaky breath. It wasn't strength, it was fear. "I was scared. We were all scared. And it was easier to be angry at her for leaving than it was to be angry at the world for what was happening to us." He looked directly at me, his eyes holding a new, unfamiliar emotion. It wasn't respect. It was a bitter, painful understanding. Calling her a traitor was the easy thing to do. The right thing to do would have been to wish her luck. He turned back to the crowd, his face grim. "So yes, I am asking you to swallow your pride. I am swallowing mine. It is a bitter, bitter pill, but I am asking you to choose. You can hold on to your anger and watch this town turn to dust, or you can accept this deal and give your children a reason to stay. There's no other choice. This is the only lifeboat coming for us. And yes, it is being captained by the person we threw overboard." He stepped back from the podium, his speech finished. The room was silent, the townspeople wrestling with the brutal choice he had laid before them. Finally, Mr. Miller, who had been the first to shout in anger, stood up slowly. "All in favor of accepting the terms of the Marshall Capital proposal?" He said, his voice heavy. "Say aye." A ragged chorus of ayes filled the room. It was not enthusiastic. It was the sound of surrender. All opposed? Silence. "The motion passes," Mr. Miller said, and sat down heavily. It was done. The deal was made. The town was mine. Caleb stood on the stage, looking out at the defeated faces of his friends and neighbors. His own face was a hollow mask of exhaustion. His eyes found mine in the front row. He knew he had just performed the most difficult act of his life, and in doing so, had handed me everything I wanted. I met his gaze. I gave him a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was not a nod of gratitude. It was not a nod of triumph. It was an acknowledgement, a seal on a contract. The transaction is complete, it said. You work for me now? He flinched, as if the silent message had been a physical blow, and then he looked away. 6 months later, the silence and redemption peak had been replaced by the cacophony of rebirth. The air, once thick with the ghosts of failure, now tasted of sawdust and welding fumes. The thunderous, rhythmic clang of hammers echoed from Main Street, where crews of local workers were tearing down plywood and installing new, gleaming storefront windows. But the most significant sound was the one coming from the valley floor, a low, powerful mechanical hum. It was the sound of the Redemption Peak timber mill, my timber mill. Stirring from its long slumber, I had not been an absentee queen. I spent 3 weeks out of every month here, living not in a new mansion on a hill, but in a Spartan rented apartment above the old post office. My real office was a portable trailer set up on the muddy grounds of the mill, a nerve center of blueprints, budgets, and timelines. From here, I orchestrated the town's resurrection with the same unsentimental precision I'd once used to. Dismantle failing companies. My weekly progress meeting was the clearest illustration of the new reality. It was held every Friday morning in my trailer. The council members, my advisory board, would sit on one side of the table. On the other side sat Caleb Thorne, my chief operating officer. This morning, he was giving his report. He was good at his job. He was a natural leader. And the mill workers, men who had once been his friends and neighbors, responded to his direction. He was competent, professional, and utterly devoid of the fire he'd once possessed. The golden boy had been reforged into a perfect, efficient tool. My tool, the new chipper, is operational ahead of schedule, he said, his eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over my left shoulder. He never made direct eye contact anymore, and the first quarter lumber contracts are finalized. We're projecting a 7% higher yield than initially forecast. Good, I said, making a note on my tablet. What's the status of the Main Street restorations? I want the new bakery and the grocery store operational by the end of next month, no exceptions. We're on track, he said, his voice flat. The new tenants you selected are signing their lease agreements this week. See what they do, I said, dismissing him with a nod. He gathered his papers, gave a curt, formal nod to the room, and left. He did his job. He took his generous paycheck, and he never spoke to me unless it was about work. Our conversations were transactions, stripped of all history, all emotion. It was exactly the arrangement I had designed. Later that afternoon, I walked through the town. The transformation was startling. New sidewalks were being poured. The facades of the old brick buildings were being cleaned, their original character emerging from under years of grime. It was a town coming back to life, a project moving forward on schedule and under budget. The people on the street, people who had once glared at me with open hostility, now offered a different kind of look. It wasn't warmth. It was a complex, uncomfortable cocktail of begrudging respect, lingering resentment, and fearful dependency. They didn't have to like me. They just had to acknowledge that their paychecks, their mortgage, their children's futures were all signed with my name. I walked into the Timberline, the diner that had once been a bastion of hostility. Sarah Dable was behind the counter. She saw me enter, and her expression became carefully, professionally neutral. "Jenna," she said, her voice even. "Sarah," I replied, taking a seat at the counter. "Coffee, please, black." She poured it without a word. The old men who were always at the counter just glanced at me, then quickly looked away, concentrating on their newspapers. I was no longer an invading stranger. I was something far more complicated. I was the source, the unavoidable, ever-present reality of their survival. The silence in the diner was no longer hostile. It was just quiet. The quiet of a town that had accepted its terms of surrender. As I drank my coffee, I thought I would feel a sense of triumphant satisfaction. I had won. In every conceivable way, I had won. I had proven them all wrong. I had saved them from their own pride and failure. This town, which had cast me out, was now entirely, completely in my debt and under my control. My revenge was perfect. As I looked at my reflection in the dark, hot coffee, I felt no joy. The fire of my anger, the fuel that had driven me to this point, had long since burned out, and it had left behind a profound, isolating emptiness. I was the queen of a town of people who would never love me, who would always, in the deepest parts of their hearts, see me as the traitor. I had returned home only to find myself more alone than I had ever been in my life. I owned everything, and I belonged nowhere. That evening, just before dusk, I drove the SUV up the winding mountain road to a place called Whitaker's Point. It was a scenic overlook I used to come to as a teenager, a place to sit on the hood of my beat-up old car and dream of anywhere. But here, from this vantage point, you could see the entire valley spread out below. I got out and leaned against the guardrail. The view was breathtaking. The setting sun painted the undersides of the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and purple. And below, nestled in the valley, was Redemption Peak, my Redemption Peak. The lights were twinkling on, not just in a few scattered houses, but across the entire town. And from the valley floor, a new light glowed with industrial intensity. The floodlights of the fully operational timber mill. Then I heard it. A sound that had been silent for a decade. A sound I had resurrected from the dead. The 5 p.m. mill whistle echoed through the valley, a deep, powerful, mournful cry. It was no longer a signal that the day's work was done. It was a signal that work had returned. It was the sound of my victory, the sound of my power, the sound of a future I had single-handedly created. I stood there, listening as the echo faded into the vast Oregon wilderness. This is what I had wanted. To stand here and see this town brought to heel, brought back to life entirely by my will. To prove to the ghost of my 8-year-old self that I had been right, that leaving had been the only way, that I was stronger, smarter, and better than all of them. But as the last echo of the whistle vanished, the triumph I expected to feel was absent. All I felt was the immense, crushing weight of my new crown. I had saved them, but in doing so, I had chained myself to them forever. My past, which I had run from so desperately, was now my future, my business, my responsibility. By prison, I looked out over my kingdom, the kingdom I had conquered. My revenge was perfect, and it was the loneliest thing I had ever known. Winter came to Redemption Peak with a vengeance. It was a proper Oregon winter, a season of bone-deep cold, relentless gray skies, and a driving, miserable rain that turned the unpaved logging roads into rivers of mud. The initial, frantic energy of the town's reconstruction had settled into the hard, grinding work of revitalization. The new bakery on Main Street was open, its windows a warm, inviting square of light against the gloom. The grocery store was fully stocked, and at the heart of it all, the Redemption timber mill was running 2 shifts, its floodlights cutting through the perpetual twilight. The restored 5 p.m. whistle a lonely but defiant cry against the encroaching. Darkness. My life had found a new, monotonous rhythm. I spent my days in the trailer, buried in logistics, supply chain management, and payroll. I spent my nights in my Spartan apartment, reading market analyses and communicating with my team. In San Francisco, I was a ghost in my own machine, a powerful, unseen force directing the town's every move. The fiery satisfaction of my revenge had cooled into a bed of embers, a low, constant, and strangely unsatisfying heat. I had absolute control, and I Was utterly, profoundly alone that my relationship with Caleb Thorne had become a masterpiece of cold, professional efficiency. We spoke every day, our conversations stripped of all personal history, existing only in the sterile, functional space of spreadsheets and production quotas. He was an exemplary QA. He was competent, tireless, and he followed my directives too. The letter. He was also a man who looked at me with the polite, empty eyes of a prisoner looking at his warden. He did his job, and he never gave me an inch of the satisfaction I had once craved. He never complained, never argued, never showed the slightest flicker of the resentful pride that had once defined him. It was, in its own way, a new form of defiance, and it was maddening. The thaw began on a Friday night in the middle of November. A storm had been battering the coast for 2 days, and the wind howled through the valley like a hungry wolf. I was about to close my laptop for the night when my phone rang. It was the mill's night shift foreman. His voice panicked. "Miss Marshall, we have a problem." "A big one." The main gearbox on the primary debarker just seized up. It's a clean break on the main shaft. We're dead in the water. I felt a surge of ice-cold adrenaline. The primary debarker was the heart of the mill's operation. Without it, the entire production line was paralyzed. We had a massive shipment of finished lumber due to be loaded onto rail cars on Monday morning, the first major contract of the new mill, the contract that was supposed to prove to the world that Redemption Peak was back in business. What's the ETA on a replacement part? I asked, my voice already in crisis management mode. "That's the problem, ma'am," he said, his voice grim. "It's a specialized German part. The supplier says the soonest they can get one to us is 10 days. Maybe more with the weather. We're going to miss the shipping deadline." Missing the deadline wasn't just a logistical problem. It was a symbolic failure, a sign that the new redemption timber was just as fragile as the old one. It would be a catastrophic blow to morale and to our fledgling reputation. "I'm on my way," I said, already grabbing my coat. The drive to the mill was treacherous. The rain coming down in blinding sheets, the wind shaking the heavy SUV. When I arrived, the main processing floor was a scene of controlled chaos. A small crew of mechanics and engineers were gathered around the silent, monolithic debarking machine, their faces grim under the harsh industrial lights. And at the center of them, soaked to the bone, his hands covered in grease, was Caleb Thorne. Hadn't been required to be here. His job was to manage, to delegate. But here he was, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, refusing to let the first promise of his town's new life die. He was looking at a complex schematic spread across a workbench when I walked up, my high-heeled boots clicking on the greasy concrete floor. He looked up, and for the first time in months, I saw a flicker of genuine emotion in his eyes, surprise quickly followed by annoyance. My presence was an intrusion on his turf. "Miss Marshall," he said, his voice tight, "you didn't need to come down here. We have it under control." My foreman's report suggested otherwise, I said, my eyes going to the dead machine. 10 days for a new part is not under control, Caleb. That's a failure. A flash of the old, prideful anger sparked in his eyes. "This isn't a software company where you can just patch the code," he retorted. "It's a 30-ton piece of machinery. When a shaft breaks, it breaks. Then we don't replace it," I said, an idea beginning to form in my analytical mind. "We fix it." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You can't fix a sheared drive shaft, Jenna. It needs to be completely reforged. There isn't a machine shop in the state that can do that kind of custom work in under a week." "You're thinking like a logger," I said, walking closer to the machine, my eyes tracing the lines of the assembly. "You need to think like an engineer. The shaft didn't just break. It broke for a reason. Stress fracture due to a vibration issue? We've checked. The motor mounts are solid. Misalignment from the initial installation. Everything is calibrated to the millimeter," he said, His answers clipped. Resentful of my interrogation, I ignored his tone and focused on the problem. We spent the next hour in a tense, rapid-fire exchange of theories and diagnostics. It was the first time we had ever truly worked together, our minds focused on a common enemy. The power dynamic of the office owner and employee began to dissolve under the pressure of the crisis. We were just two smart, capable people trying to solve an impossible problem. He knew the machine, its sounds, its rhythms. I knew the physics, the systems, the cold, hard engineering principles, and then looking at the schematics, I saw it. A secondary hydraulic dampener designed to absorb harmonic vibrations from the main motor. What's the pressure reading on? This, I asked, pointing. Caleb followed my finger. It's within spec. We checked. Did you check it under full load? I pressed. Or just at idle? He paused, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. He turned and yelled an instruction to the foreman. A few minutes later, the answer came back. Under full operational load. The pressure in the secondary dampener was dropping by almost 30%. It wasn't absorbing the vibration. It was amplifying it, sending a slow, rhythmic, invisible shockwave through the entire machine that had eventually fatigued the main shaft. I'll be damned, Caleb whispered, staring at the schematic as if seeing it for the first time. It wasn't a flaw in the shaft, it was a flaw in the system. It's always a flaw in the system, I said. The solution was a brilliant, desperate piece of backwoods engineering that only Caleb could have conceived. He knew of an old, decommissioned machine in the mill's boneyard with a similar, but much larger, hydraulic dampener. For the next 4 hours, we worked with the crew, a strange, unified team, cannibalizing the old machine, adapting the parts, and retrofitting the dampener onto the debarker. Caleb was in his element, his hands sure and skilled, directing the welders and mechanics with a natural authority I had never seen in our meetings. I, in turn, worked on the pressure calculations, recalibrating the system on my laptop to accommodate the new, non-standard part. At 4 a.m., exhausted, filthy, and soaked, we were ready. Caleb gave the signal. The foreman hit the switch. The massive machine shuddered, whirred, and then roared to life, the sound of its successful operation echoing through the vast, quiet mill. The crisis was averted. The shipment would be saved. The crew erupted in a tired, triumphant cheer. Caleb and I just stood there, watching the machine work, the tension slowly bleeding out of us. One by one, the crew members packed up, giving us respectful, curious nods as they left, until it was just the two of us, standing alone in the pre-dawn quiet. You didn't have to stay, he said, his back still to me. It's my investment. I replied, I protect my investments. He finally turned to face me. The mask of the coup was gone. He just looked like Caleb, a tired man who had just pulled off a small miracle. Why, Jenna? He asked, his voice raw. Why are you really doing all this? It can't just be about the money. And after all this time, it can't just be about getting even with me. I looked away from him at the rain still streaking down the high, grimy windows of the mill, and I gave him an answer that was more honest than any I had ever given to myself. I don't know anymore, I said softly. At first, it was about revenge. It felt good to watch you all squirm. It felt good to win. I paused, the confession, feeling strange and heavy on my tongue. But I remember when I was a little girl, the sound of the 5 p.m. whistle. It meant my dad was on his way home from this mill. It meant dinner would be on the table. It meant everything was okay. It meant we were safe. I looked back at him. I hated this town for making me leave. But maybe, I don't know, maybe I just wanted to hear that whistle again. The admission, so small and vulnerable, hung in the air between us. The space that had been filled with 15 years of anger. Pride and resentment was now occupied by a fragile shared understanding. He didn't pity me. He didn't absolve me. He just nodded slowly. He unscrewed the cap from a large, dented thermos and poured the steaming contents into a cup. He held it out to me. "Coffee's probably cold," he said, "but it's all we've got." I took it. We stood there in the quiet mow as the first faint hint of a gray dawn began to light the sky, sharing a thermos of lukewarm coffee. The war was over. The revenge was complete. But here, in the cold, greasy heart of the machine, I had resurrected. Something new, something unexpected had just begun to stir. The thaw had begun.